Hey guys, what's going on? I'm here talking with Michael Tracy. Michael Tracy is a fantastic journalist. He did some great work during the campaign season. I think he was one of few journalists who, I can safely say was really holding Hillary Clinton accountable throughout the entire process. I mean, as we know, many people on the left, as soon as the primary was over, they decided, well, I mean, I guess it's the goal is play defense now for the Democratic Party, and you attack Trump, and it's not that there aren't many legitimate things to attack Trump for, but if you want to be intellectually honest, I mean, you got to go after Hillary too for all of, her atrocious record. So you were one of the few people. I love following you on Twitter during this whole thing because it was always refreshing to see that there were some people out there who were like, yeah, I'm not going to let you get away with your bullshit just because you're up against this monster. So I know that now you decided you did some work on you're doing like a pundit accountability thing where all these mainstream journalists who just made preposterous predictions and said things that were just dead wrong. You're like, as far as I can tell, the only person who's working on actually holding them accountable. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm calling it the Pundit and Accountability Jihad, or initiative, or crusade, or whatever kind of hyperbolic way you want to put it. That works for me.
Right.
Just because, yeah, no, the people who reside in these elite opinion making spheres, they have an influence on setting the terms and the tenor of the wider national discourse, right? So your average, unemployed steelworker in Western Pennsylvania might not be reading Slate all day, but he still lives in a society where Slate is seen as an influential node, so to say, and just in terms of crafting how politics sort of function. So that's why I think it's useful to keep a close eye on how these outlets are handling themselves, and namely some particular pundits who, it really needs to be said, were just so spectacularly wrong that if there's no accountability, and if they pay no reputational price whatsoever, then it's pretty much guaranteed that this stuff will just keep happening over and over again, right? So, I perceive there to, I mean, we hold politicians accountable, we hold all sorts of other public figures accountable, and rightly so. So if someone has a platform and they're attempting to shape public opinion with that platform, I think they've voluntarily opened themselves up to this kind of critical scrutiny, but a lot of them don't really like it for
Yeah.
obvious reasons.
Yeah, you mentioned Slate there, I mean, they're kind of on the top of my list. I mean, in the wake of the election, I've kind of had it out for Jamal Buoy because of a bunch of the stuff that he's written. I mean, just to give people an example, he wrote an article. It was titled like "There's no such thing as a good Trump voter," which I mean, what are you not trying to get at the truth as to why he won the election? Are you not like just this unsympathetic, like shut off mind approach and tribalism, really? Because it's like, hey, if you're on Team Hillary, you're good. If you're on Team Trump, you're bad. Just this unreflective reactionary thinking. And then also what he said about Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, because Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren basically made the case on various shows that, look, if Donald Trump wants to do like a reasonable infrastructure bill, or if he wants to protect Social Security, or if he wants to block TPP, or any of the other reasonable things he said, well, of course we're going to work with him on that, but we're just going to, block anything he does that's horrible, anything that's racist, sexist, bigoted, you name it, we're going to block it. Well, he thought that was, this beyond the pale, insane position, and if you work with him on anything, even if it's a good thing, you're just justifying, all the negative positions he has. Like, how dare you justify his presidency by cutting a deal on some things where you can agree? And that kind of thinking, I mean, there are almost no words for how silly that is. The last minimum wage increase we got was under George W. Bush. And according to his thinking, everybody who accepted that minimum wage increase agrees with the Iraq War, because the Iraq War was hideous, but the minimum wage increase was good. So it's just, he's on the top of my list of people who, were terrible in that regard. Are there any people who, you specifically thought, like, these are the worst offenders?
No, I've been focusing on Bowie as well, and not because I have any personal animus toward him. I don't know him. I mean, I've interacted with him a couple times here and there, but it's not as if I harbor this deep and passionate resentment toward him as an individual. It's just, the stuff that he put out into the public realm was wrong and is actually harmful in a way, because it's, as you laid out there, it's sort of shaping public perceptions even post elections. I actually wrote a post myself on TPP, right? So the TPP was one of the marquee issues of the Sanders campaign, I think that's fair to say, right? He drew a sharp distinction between his views on trade policy versus Hillary Clinton's. And then at the Democratic convention, I think everybody remembers the Sanders delegates waving the no TPP signs. They were doing no TPP chants. That was probably, if not the top issue of the Sanders delegates in Philadelphia, definitely among them, right? So I just wanted to know, what is the proper response when now the election of Trump has solidified the nixing of TPP? I mean, you can celebrate that discrete outcome without necessarily being bound to celebrating Trump overall. I mean, that's just basic logic.
Right.
I know some of these like Twitter personalities like to denigrate the notion of logic as if it's some kind of like elite, snarky tendency. No, it's a mode of philosophical inquiry that people should study. And logic dictates that in order to cheer Trump's decision to cancel the TPP, which he's now confirmed, that doesn't compel you to say, I'm now a Trump supporter, I'm going to wear a Make America Great Again hat, I'm going to go dance in the streets every time Trump does something good. No, it means just you're being logically consistent. And for Bowie to now say to Sanders and Elizabeth Warren that they're somehow implicated by association with the more noxious things Trump has done, if they offered to work with him on individual specific initiatives, I mean, that's just bad for the country. I mean, forget about Sanders and Warren personally. We want people who are of a reasonable bent to have as much influence as they can with the incoming administration, right? That's just common sense. So if Bernie's able to nudge Trump in a more fruitful direction on, say, infrastructure spending, he should seize that opportunity, I think. But you're going to have these Bowie types saying that if Sanders does that, that means somehow he's a stealth racist, or he's legitimizing or normalizing Trump. So that's why I think it's worthwhile to just go back and survey their past analytical failings, because hopefully that will indicate to people that maybe their present analysis shouldn't be taken at face value either.
So who are I mean, I saw them too. There were a bunch of pundits who, I mean, you said it at the beginning here. They're just factually wrong about many of the things they said. The things they said would come to fruition simply didn't come to fruition. And I'm curious. So I think Jamal Buoy was one of them. I think I was looking at some of his past work, and he wrote an article that was like, it's not even close. It's going to be like a Hillary landslide against Trump after it was clear that they got the nominations. Do you know of any others? I'm off the top of my head, I'm kind of blanking here a little bit, but I know that there were a bunch that basically said, like, this is going to be a historic landslide. Hillary Clinton is going to win. In fact, that was kind of like the default position among the elite pundit class, was like, you're kind of crazy if you think for a second that he even has a chance.
Yeah, not only you're crazy, they would tar you as a secret Trump supporter. So if you were to say that, my assessment of the electorate leads me to believe that Trump has a than better odds of winning relative to the pundit consensus, that automatically invited accusations of supporting Trump. When in reality, what it was, at least for me, a dispassionate attempt to gauge what the actual status of the electorate was. But there are a lot of people who are implicated in this. But I want to focus. I want to quote Bowie real quickly, if you don't mind.
Please.
Maybe I can do it in a sort of dramatic Shakespearean sort of tones or something. Um, so on August 24th, 2016, Bowie writes at Slate, quote, "There is no horse race here. Clinton is far enough ahead at a late enough stage in the election that what we have is a horse running by itself, unperturbed, but for a faint possibility of a comet hitting the track. Place your bets accordingly. Okay, so that is Buoy, who has a platform as a top political commentator, failing at his most basic responsibility, which is to accurately inform his readers about the state of things. So I don't know. I can't psychologically diagnose him, and I want to. But I think one reason why a lot of people might have done that is because they were so viscerally repelled by Trump that they allowed that to overtake their cognitive sort of filtering system, such that they selectively interpreted various data to conform with their pre-existing belief that Trump couldn't possibly win. That's the top thing that a pundit should guard against. I mean, you would that would be it would be understandable if a layperson, like a non-pundit, a non-professional, succumbed to that bias. But if anybody, a professional, somebody who gets paid to do this full time, who's like, you had one job, that's sort of the meme, right?
Yep.
If that's your one job, then you need to really diligently guard against that. And to see so many pundits, Buoy foremost among them, just give in to that impulse, I mean, that's really disturbing.
Yeah, I think if anything, I actually think you might even be a little too kind to them. I would flat out call a bunch of them frauds. I would call them hacks. And when you go back, I mean, I remember after the 2012 election, I mean, it was hilarious looking at some of the pundits. So, for example, Larry Kudlow, the CNBC host, predicted Mitt Romney would win in a landslide with over 300 electoral votes. You had the usual suspects like Glenn Beck said the same thing. Rush Limbaugh said the same thing. George Will on Fox News said the same thing. So there were a bunch of these like right-wing partisan pundits who said Romney's going to win in a landslide, and they simply weren't able to separate what they wanted to happen from what the empirical evidence said was going to happen. Now, that's pretty similar to what happened this time around with these people that we're talking about now. And, I mean, I guess the only difference is, yes, you could say Hillary was certainly up in the polls, but, it's not like there wasn't a path for him, and it's not like there weren't many signs and just a lot of evidence that kept mounting as to how she was a weaker candidate than many people thought. Like, for example, the fact that she continued to snub Bernie voters when she got to the general election. She immediately ran to the right. She was courting neocons and giving speeches with neocons in the general election. She picked Tim Kaine for VP, a guy who's, roughly -8 people are enthusiastic about him, and he's a guy who's pro-TPP. She ran a 1990s-style campaign at a populist time in the country. So, like, all these signs were there, and anybody who really is being objective about it is not going to say something as stupid as, yeah, it's going to almost certainly going to be her in a landslide. So I really think there needs to be accountability for this, man. This is why I like what you're doing, because at what point do people say, oh, you're like a fraud and you don't know what the fuck you're talking about? And then meanwhile, not to toot my own horn or anything, but 3 contests in to the Republican primary, I said it'd be a minor miracle if Trump didn't win. And this was when fucking Nate Silver was still writing articles saying there's no way Trump is going to win. So, there are people who were right all along who are still kind of marginalized and viewed as fringe, and people who were wrong who are still viewed as the mainstream, and then, by the way, still want to have say in which direction the Democratic Party should go now, which is preposterous.
And that's the thing here. That's another thing, and that's why I think it's important to embark on this little jihad that I have going. Because when you have, if you're an ordinary American worker and you fail consistently your job over the course of a year and a half, number one, you're not going to make it a full year and a half. You can maybe make it a couple days, if that, and then you're going to face some kind of professional sanction. You are not going to be permitted to just carry on as if nothing happened. But that's what I call the pundit industrial complex is allowed to do. They never face any kind of material repercussions for their bad job performance. So if I'm an ordinary American worker And my job is precarious, and I have to make sure that I cross every T and dot every I, so that my boss doesn't come swoop down and whatever dock me. And then I see that this elite media class, I mean, who purport to be experts, but whose expertise is actually based on nothing real. I mean, it's just that is a fraud in a lot of ways. The way that they kind of present themselves as having unique insight, but I put it this way: most of like people who troll me on Twitter have better insight than most of these pundits.
Right. Yeah.
But the incentive structure in this media ecosystem is totally inverted. So, like you said, I'm not expecting you to get a victory parade or anything, but I was most of my instincts tended to be roughly correct, and it seems like yours were as well. So you'd expect that to redound to our professional benefit in some way, right?
Right.
Not to whine about it, but that's just how it would work if it was like a real meritocracy, which all these people claim that they want. But instead, it's the same people who are chronically wrong are in receive just as many accolades, just as much prestige, just as much television talk show slots, just as many invitations to go speak at universities, and so on and so forth. So where does that leave us? I mean, I likened it to um, the I mean I've likened the mass systemic failure around this election to the Iraq War and even the financial crisis. So two really formative moments in our political discourse in which elites caused this huge, astounding failure that really harmed the country. But very few of them, if any, faced any kind of sanction afterwards. So not surprisingly, the patterns which led to the failure persisted. I think that's what's going on now. I mean, one thing that just amazes me is the certitude with which many of these pundits made their pronouncements. So I maintained all along that Trump had better odds than was popularly assumed, but I never stated, flat out, Trump is going to win. I did that in private with just in kind of casual conversations, and I actually was goaded into one Twitter bet. But for the most part, I wasn't going around doing these stating with 100% certainty that this outcome will happen, because there's always going to be uncertainty. But if you look at, I just got sent. People keep sending me these articles from before the election that are examples of hubris, right, on the part of these pundits, and anybody out there watching, keep sending them, because I'll never get tired of it. But on October 20th, so after the third debate, the final debate, this guy Ben White, who's go on Twitter at Morning Money Ben. I don't know if you've seen this guy.
No.
He wrote. You're not missing much. This guy, he wrote a column on CNBC, and his final sentence is, he's referring to Trump here. Quote: He failed and is going to lose. Okay, so that doesn't give you any. That doesn't give you any wiggle room there. I mean, you've stated with absolute certainty that you have your crystal ball and you know what's going to happen, because you're able to sit on 538 and refresh the model 12 times a day, right? So is Morning Money Ben gonna be held accountable in any sense whatsoever for
No.
that statement?
Probably not.
No, I don't think so. And that's the hallmark of sort of a decadent elite culture, right? I mean, they could fail over and over again, and there's no consequence at all.
Yeah, I think that this kind of stuff actually probably hurt Hillary too, because it had this sense of this Democratic establishment bubble where they all thought, oh, we're marching towards this historic moment where we break the glass ceiling and have our first female president. And it's almost like they viewed the election as like this, like a nuisance that's just in the way, and let's just get it over with, and then finally we'll have what the rightful outcome is supposed to be. And then meanwhile, you got the other guy who, he was really rallying like crazy. He was out there, I mean, in the exact states he needed to be out there in the Rust Belt, in the areas where he had a chance to pick the states off. And meanwhile, Hillary didn't even step foot in Wisconsin. She was busy having a fucking party with, or a concert with Bruce Springsteen and Obama giving a speech with so many people out there, and it had this sense of like, almost like they were forcing her on the American people, and there was this sense of like condescension, like we're above the election. We don't even need to do the hard work and dot the I's and cross the T's. I mean, there were stories of offices, Hillary Clinton's offices in certain states going, look, we're warning you, there's like zero enthusiasm on the ground for her. And then meanwhile, you compare back to Obama in 2008, they had to turn away people who were coming to volunteer because there were just so many people. So it's almost like, I feel like it hurt her too in a sense, having like the Hollywood establishment behind her, and then obviously the financial establishment behind her and Wall Street behind her, and you opened up the door for this guy to make the argument that, well, I'm the outsider, I'm the anti-establishment guy, I'm the one looking out for the little guy. And that's the first election in my lifetime that you had the Republican candidate making that argument. Usually it's the Democratic candidate who more holds up the mantle of, I'm the outsider.
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason why a lot of these pundits were so drastically wrong is that few of them bother to do any reporting anymore. I mean, some of them don't do any reporting at all. I mean, their conception of reporting is sitting on Twitter and aggregating jokes.
Right.
But I made a point too in the like 10 days leading up to the election to go out on the road in some of these swing states. I mean, it seemed pretty reasonable to want to do that, right? So I went to Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and I kept telling people, I haven't met one person, a single person, literally under 30, just over the course of my normal interactions with people. So obviously it's going to be a bit of a skewed sample because it's just my anecdotal experience, right? But I thought, nevertheless, it did seem worth noting because, like you mentioned, in 2008, it didn't take much effort at all to find enthusiastic Obama supporters, right? I mean, I didn't find a single enthusiastic Hillary supporter under the age of 30 in any of these three states that were key to the election. So, and that was people of all races, all genders, right? I mean, even people who did say that they would probably vote for her would only do so very begrudgingly, and that's not a good indicator of enthusiasm because you need like a certain level of people who feel that they want to take an affirmative step to go vote for you as a candidate, rather than just doing some kind of strategic thing or wanting to stop the opponent.
Right.
So, I mean, that to me was one reason why you needed a certain amount of experiential data in concert with the numerical data that everybody can get by just sitting on their computer and refreshing the New York Times upshot all day, right?
Yep.
And I agree that the over-reliance on that and this level of certainty that it seemed to foster did end up backfiring on Hillary because if you're, say you are a relatively enthusiastic Hillary supporter, and you're contemplating whether you're going to make a trip to a swing state the weekend before the election to help get out the vote, if you're looking at Nate Silver or Nate Cohen or these other people who are like the Huffington Post polling aggregator, which said over what was it, 99.2% chance of a Hillary win?
Yeah, it was over 98%.
Yes, something ridiculous. Then you might not feel especially motivated to take your weekend and go, travel from New Jersey to Pennsylvania or something, right?
Right.
So I mean that's another irony of this, and then and it just like you mentioned that there was this sense that the campaign was just this obstacle for Hillary or this inconvenience or a nuisance. I think it's true, and that went back to the primary as well.
Oh yeah.
I mean that's why every Democratic elected official, superdelegate, kind of establishment pundit, they all, I mean, without even a debate, without even waiting a moment to kind of get a lay of the ground, they all got behind Hillary as if it was just her turn.
Yeah.
And I think that ended up rubbing a lot of people the wrong way, especially young people, such that they were never really going to be enthused about her. They get enthused. I mean, and this applies to Trump as well. So look at Trump 16, Obama 08. People get enthused because they see a new force sort of bursting onto the scene. It's not something they've like kind of mildly tolerated their whole lives and they have to resign themselves to. No, it's something that's sort of new and even invigorating. Obviously, it comes from different ends of the parts of the spectrum, but nevertheless, it sort of has a sense of like a break from the past. So for her to just feel like she could coast on this inevitability presumption, I think was really, really hubristic on their part. And and like it wasn't a mystery that this would happen. I mean, people were pointing this out all along, especially the Bernie supporters. But I don't know, they didn't want to hear it, or they were too insulated, or they were too just self-assured. I don't know, but it's going to take a long time to really sort out what factors led them to adopt so many false beliefs about her chances. But I mean, it
Yeah.
was I keep emphasizing it wasn't like it was hidden from view. A lot of people were pointing it out.
Oh yeah, no, and we did the same thing. I mean, a lot of her support was kind of a house of cards because if you think about it, going into the election, she was the first lady. She was Secretary of State. She was a well-known senator from New York. She already had like official celebrity status, and she went up against this obscure senator from Vermont who only really big-time political junkies knew before this, and this is a guy who is 1,006 years old. He doesn't comb his hair. He calls himself a democratic socialist, but sometimes he just socialist is what comes out. People were speculating, oh, maybe he's an atheist. He's got bad posture. He's up there, but people saw this guy, and he managed to get 47% of the vote in the Democratic primary, and he managed to win 22 states. I mean, if that wasn't like just the biggest sign ever to the Hillary people that they got to wake up. And they didn't wake up because we saw how they ran the campaign in the general election. And they basically did the opposite of what they were supposed to do. I mean, there were so many things they could have done to, like, basically give an olive branch to the base. Look at what Trump did. Trump picked Pence for VP. Pence is, a massively anti-gay, conservative Indiana governor. And again, Hillary picked Tim Kaine. That's just a slap in the face to her base. And it was this attitude of like, and then later on when it was clear that millennials were leaving them in droves, she does, fucking concerts with Katy Perry and jokes about Pokemon Go on the trail. And it's like, looking back at it, it's one of those things where like everybody can look back and in hindsight go, yeah, of course, it looked inevitable that she was going to lose because it was all a house of cards. And the flip side is true with Trump. Now, again, some of us saw it coming earlier, but you look back and you go, no, yeah, of course he was going to win. Definitely the primary. Look who he was up against. Marco Rubio, the most insincere person on the planet. Jeb Bush, the most boring person on the planet with the last name Bush. And then you got this guy who goes up there, and again, Trump doesn't get credit for bucking GOP orthodoxy as much as he did. And what Trump did is he showed, and Hillary did too, that the old playbook is not real. Like in the Republican primary, what you're supposed to do, you're supposed to go up there and act far right, and you're supposed to all agree, yeah, we need to cut Social Security, we need to cut Medicare, we don't bring up infrastructure spending. Trump went up there and said, I'm going to protect Social Security, I'm going to protect Medicare, I am going to do infrastructure spending. He screamed about how the towers came down under Bush at a fucking Republican primary debate, and he won that debate. We all should have known after that debate, that's it, it's over. This guy's going to win the primary, and there was signs there he could easily win the general too.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking back to that South Carolina Republican debate, which is the one you just referenced before the South Carolina primary. And prior to that primary, there was this bogus pundit conventional wisdom that was so easily disproven, even prior to Trump winning, which held that the South Carolina Republican electorate just loves the Bushes. I mean, they have this kind of visceral admiration for the Bushes. That's why he won in 2000 there. And for some reason, they have this kind of nostalgic connection to the Bush family, and that's why Jeb would somehow be favored. But of course, Trump ends up winning all delegates in South Carolina primary after getting on stage at one of these debates and saying the towers came down, basically almost like going up to the edge of 9/11 trutherism.
Right.
Or at least I know that a lot of 9/11 truthers were really excited about that moment. He didn't like endorse any conspiracy theories outright, but it was like as far as any prominent national figure had really gone up to that point. And he said, they lied. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none. I mean, it's such an incredible moment
Yep.
to have Trump sound like Michael Moore, um, at a Republican presidential debate. So I mean, like you said, so that should have been an indication that there was something afoot here that kind of broke from how people conceived of the two parties and their respective coalitions. Actually, it's one reason why I'm always a little annoyed at the popular liberal depiction of Trump, because we all know there are plenty of problems with Trump, and there are plenty of real things to focus on with Trump that are legitimately scandalous and legitimately worrisome. But they'll, at the same time, I mean, they kind of like oscillate back and forth between Trump as a fascist, Trump is a conventional Romney type Republican, and Trump is, I don't know, they have all sorts of depictions, and they're all inconsistent. And they don't take into account, so they'll say, like, Trump, when he says something that can be construed as racially inflammatory, they'll say Trump literally meant that as a reflection of the policy that he wants to implement, right? But when he runs a whole campaign, primary and general, on not cutting Social Security or Medicare,
He
which he
doesn't
was
mean that.
consistent on,
Yeah,
he doesn't mean that.
Yeah,
I mean, that
exactly.
we disregard. And when he runs against the Iraq
Yep.
War, that we totally disregard. So, I mean, I just think there's like a fundamental inconsistency there. It's like
Totally.
and it's part of that inconsistency, I think, which led to this hubris around Hillary.
Yes.
So I don't know. I just don't know how they reconcile that. I don't even know if they care to reconcile
Yeah.
it.
No, exactly. On that point, I was just talking about this yesterday. Judd Legum, who is
Oh God.
yeah, exactly, who's a writer for Think Progress or an editor, whatever the fuck he is over
And
there.
a former communicator, he worked for the Hillary 2008 campaign.
Right. So, he was when we first got the news about this carrier deal, how Carrier is going to keep some of their jobs in America now. Before we got any of the details, and all we knew was Carrier basically said on Twitter, like, yeah, we made a deal and we're keeping jobs here. When that's all we knew, Judd Legum goes on Twitter and starts, like, attacking Trump over that. It's like, well, wait. Aren't you a liberal? Like, aren't you supposed to be for jobs staying in America? And now, look, later on, just to get all the facts out there and to be clear, when you read the details of the deal, he went about keeping the jobs in here the wrong way by doing corporate welfare and promising deregulation. And all liberals can agree that the way he went about it was the wrong thing. But for you to not take a moment and say, you know what, credit where credit is due, he said he was going to do that, and he's going to do that, that just shows, to me, that shows you're just a hack. That you're basically playing for a fucking team, and that overrides truth and empirical reality. And you're willing to, and then also he goes on to attack Trump, rightly, for some conflicts of interest that he has with his business. Now, again, I totally agree with that, and that's stuff I talk about all the time. But these are the same people who gave Hillary a total pass for the Clinton Foundation, and for just things that have been proven, like with Qatar, for example, them giving Bill Clinton $1 million for his birthday, and then look at that, they approve a weapons deal that goes to Qatar, as Hillary's prancing around saying women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. They're fucking funding the Saudi regime, who's slaughtering women and children in Yemen, and they don't let women drive. And so if you're gonna just be consistent, that's the thing that annoys me, is that it's so obvious with so many of these people that and it's like they have to know that they're hacks. How do you not know you're a hack if all of a sudden you're concerned about business conflicts of interest and corruption, but only when it's Trump and not when it's Hillary, when there was so much evidence on the table that that's an issue with Hillary too?
Well, when somebody like Judd goes down that path, I don't think anybody should be surprised, because he's literally, I mean, he's not a journalist. Think Progress sort of kind of portrays itself as some kind of pseudo news outlet, but it was a de facto wing of the Hillary campaign. Everybody can discern that.
As Media Matters was too.
Right. Through the primary and the general election campaign, by the way.
Yes.
So, I mean, we wouldn't expect for him to be consistent at all. We would expect him to have a reflexive opposition to anything Trump does, irrespective of the merits of what Trump does,
But there are
because it's Trump.
Sorry, let me just cut you off real quick, because the point, like, there are ways to attack him that are totally legitimate, where guys like you and me would go, you're making a good point, but it's like they choose the worst ways to attack him, and in my opinion, that only makes him stronger.
Yeah, and that's why I keep pointing this stuff out. Not because I want to help Trump. I don't want to help Trump. Because if people get mired in this instinct to just reflexively oppose everything he does because he's Trump, then that's going to weaken you as an opposition force,
Yes.
and it's going to have the effect of strengthening Trump.
Yes.
So Trump's going to end up getting away with things that an effective opposition could hold him to account for.
Yes.
Because they're so kind of self-destructive and almost pathological in their hysteria. So I mean, the carrier thing is a great example. Yeah, when it first came out, like when I saw it on Twitter, like I knew right away. I didn't even have to check. I knew what the reaction was going to be among a certain liberal set. Right? It was going to be this is fake, this is a fraud, this is that. So I mean, my point was always okay. So the deal, the details of the deal are that Trump promised some kind of regulatory reform or tax breaks to Carrier in exchange for them keeping, what is it, 1,100 jobs, 700, something in that range.
Yeah, 800
So I
was
mean,
the last time I saw.
okay, so it's possible to say that yes, for the individual workers who are now able to keep their jobs and their livelihoods, who are 50 something years old and don't want to be suddenly retrained at a job they've been doing for decades, this is pretty clearly a good thing, right?
Unquestionably.
Okay, so maybe it's symbolic, maybe the macroeconomic element of it isn't fully desirable. All that's a legitimate debate. But just like assert without qualification that it's just bad with a capital B because it's Trump. I mean, that's
just
just
not
foolish.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just foolish. I mean, so I mean, I wanted to hear from the union representative who was involved because initially it was reported that they went over the head of the union and they weren't involved in the negotiations. And that's true. Trump negotiated directly with the head of the company, right? But then CNN went and found the union rep, this cranky older guy named Jones. I forget his first name now. Um, and he said, I didn't support Trump. I actually hammered his ass real good over the campaign. Like that's the way he put it. But he praised Trump and he was thankful to Trump. Okay, so are you just gonna like erase quote unquote that guy's take on how this is affecting his membership because you want to score cheap points against Trump? I mean, if that's the way that these liberal pundits and journalism people are going to comport themselves, they're just going to drive themselves insane. And within like 6 months or probably less. I think a lot of them are already insane after the campaign, obviously, but they're going to become ineffectual opposition. That's what I worry about.
Yeah, and they're
Um,
going to get in that bubble more and more and more, and they're going to alienate more and more and more people, and they get to the point where they do, like Jamal Buoy did, they write articles like, there's no such thing as a good Trump voter. Because instead of, it's easier to just blame and deflect and don't do any self-criticism than to really take a minute and go, well, hold on now, where did we go wrong here? I mean, she lost to somebody who said, I grabbed them by the pussy, I don't even wait. She lost to somebody who at one point had a 63% unfavorable rating in the general election. If I'm not mistaken, on election day, it was like 60%. How do you lose to that person? You have to be doing something really, really wrong. And it turns out one of the big things, because you lost the white working class in the Rust Belt, that means that one of the main things was NAFTA. Your husband signed NAFTA. They lost their fucking jobs, and their factory towns are now depressed. And this guy was pounding the pavement against TPP, and you were too full of hubris and entitlement to stop and reflect on it and go, well, maybe, that should be a core message of mine. But again, that's maybe she actively chose not to go down that road because we all know how much money Wall Street gives her, and she simply can't bring herself to go out there and pretend like she's so against these deals, only tepidly being against it. That's as far as she'll go when, as we know, she pushed for TPP 45 times and called it the gold standard before she came out against it, which, by the way, she should thank Bernie Sanders for, because she would have lost even more if he didn't push her to say, at least, yeah, I guess I'm against it.
yeah, and we should really drill down on how pernicious that mindset is that led to that Bowie item where he's saying every Trump voter is a bad person, essentially,
Yeah, they're
or
all racist. They're all racist and sexist.
morally flawed.
Yeah.
So that's what 63,200,000 people or something.
Right.
So that's basically you're ostracizing. What is it? A quarter of the American population
And you're
as
generalizing, and that's a bigoted thing to say.
as irredeemable and deplorable. So now we know where the Hillary tirade came from, right?
Right.
It's the same mindset.
Yeah,
But just think of how I could do the mirror image of that for the Hillary voter, which I would never do, but I could do it.
right.
So I abstained from voting. I wrote out all my rationale, and a large part of why I abstained had to do with Hillary's atrocious record of foreign policy. I felt that it couldn't be countenanced to be involved in that many failures and to not change your ways at all, and then be rewarded with a vote for the presidency. So that was my personal view in terms of my own ethical reasoning. So I could easily do the mirror image of the Buoy take and say, everyone who voted for Hillary, so 64 billion people, or however many it is right now, because unfortunately they still haven't finished counting all the votes, even though it's almost a month after the election at this point. World's greatest democracy hashtag, right?
Yep.
Every Hillary voter is morally blemished because they chose to legitimize somebody who was central in enabling the Iraq War, defended the Iraq War over the course of the entire 2008 campaign against Obama, and then, far from learning from her errors, committed additional errors by agitating for the Libya intervention, Syria arming with the rebels,
Right.
It's so on and so forth. We don't have to go down the full list.
Yeah.
So I could say that by extension, everybody who enabled that and voted for Hillary is a bad person, but I wouldn't do that because that would be unfair to those millions of people who have a whole variety of reasons why they would maybe have voted for Hillary.
Totally.
So, I mean, you're sort of removing the agency of these people by saying, because your hobby horse is X, everybody else must be totally consumed with X, and therefore that justifies you discounting them as moral inferiors, and you can go around and flaunt your superiority on these slate takes and feel good about yourself.
If you or I see somebody say something, like, oh, Muslims, they're evil, they're terrorists, we'd go, that is one of the dumbest fucking things I've ever heard. That, like, what are you saying? But a guy like Jamal Buoy, there's no such thing as a good Trump voter. That's what he says. And then again, by implication, it's, oh, they're racist, they're sexist, they're bigoted, they're this, they're that. So why is it that no nuance is allowed in the conversation about Trump voters, but it's allowed in other areas? I mean, it's like they're trying not to get to an answer. They're just playing for a team, and that satisfies them enough. But I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier that I thought was really interesting. You had mentioned actually the financial crisis and the failure of the media in that respect, and that's something that I had forgot about. But you're totally right about that. I remember back, I think it was Jon Stewart actually had like Jim Cramer or some goofy person like that on his show, and basically was like, it played clips of him like, saying, oh, the market's going to be good and it's going to bounce back, and this was like in 2007, right before the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession. And then you stop and you look back, and it was over 90%, probably over 95% of the commentary and the hosts on CNBC, the supposed, financial expert network, where none of them saw it coming. None of them knew that we were in a bubble when fucking amateurs like myself, I could look at that and go, oh, we're in a bubble. None of them knew it was coming, and then there was this giant crash, and yet again, zero accountability. So what scares me is that if in a situation where it's that clear, you have financial experts who didn't see this giant crash coming, there's no accountability, it's almost like it feels inevitable that there's no accountability for all these pundits who said it's going to be a landslide for Hillary Clinton, and they did it with just terrible arguments and not good evidence. And, it worries me about the direction of the country and also the direction of the Democratic Party, because those same forces are the forces who are now saying, no, so we're gonna rebuild. Wait, but you guys were responsible for destroying the party. No, but it's cool. We're gonna be the ones to rebuild, and we're gonna pick the direction. And their lesson is always the wrong one. So, just to give a random example here, Allison Lundergan Grimes ran against Mitch McConnell in Kentucky. And she's a Democrat. This was when Mitch McConnell's approval rating was abysmally low. He was super vulnerable. And she lost to him. And she lost because she ran like a really gross, like, I'm a right-wing Democrat kind of campaign. She wouldn't even admit to voting for Obama. And then when they lose, the answer was she ran too far to the right, but they said, no, the problem was she didn't run far right enough. And it's the same thing with, the Hillary Clinton wing of the Democratic Party hanging on to power. And, the pundit class, the Hillary Clinton pundit class hanging on to power. The idea is like the exact wrong conclusion. It's like, let's be more in our bubble. Let's be more insufferable. Let's hold on more to identity politics and not listen to voters. And it's just bound to fail again.
Yeah, I remember covering that 2014 race between McConnell and Grimes, and I almost don't know that it was because Grimes was seen as running too far to the right, so much as if she was seen as doing it in a really superficial, pandering way. So it didn't come across as authentic at all. It seemed slimy and like what you would expect a typical politician to do. So I almost think if the Democrats had nominated somebody who was like sort of even on the center right flank of the party, it's feasible that they could have won. Like, say they had nominated Jim Webb. I mean, Jim Webb isn't a left-wing zealot by any stretch, right? But wouldn't have come across as personally corrupt and personally compromised in the same way that Hillary had. I don't know for sure that he would have won. I'm saying he could have had a decent chance because he didn't have the reason why Hillary lost is because she had these unique personal characteristics that turned off a lot of people, whether it was her legal issues or her personality traits or the kind of the sense of corruption that's just sort of emanated from her. I mean, I mean, I think there's a tendency to want to see the election result as a vindication of left-wing politics, and I think that may be true in certain respects. But one reason Bernie engendered a lot of support is because he came across in a similar fashion. He didn't seem, even if you disagreed with him, you still thought he was an okay guy. I heard that over and over again, even from people who self-identify as conservatives. So if you look at a lot of the exit polling from the primaries, like I remember in the New Hampshire primary, Bernie won self-described conservative voters. And I think that's because they viewed him as personally virtuous. So they might not necessarily have been on board with the socialist agenda, right? But that really wasn't what was most operative in their in the way that they kind of come at political opinions.
So there are two things there. One is, would I have taken the chances of anybody other than Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump? The answer is yes. I would have taken somebody like Jim Webb, who I massively disagree with. Again, I would have taken, I think, anybody. And then you're also touching on the personality aspect, and that's an interesting new development where, again, the 1990s-style politician is no longer in style, in season. They want the authenticity, even if it's in the form of a really old guy who has bad posture and speaks with his hands up here. So that's all true. But I do think the election is a vindication of left-wing politics, because even in the example you gave of, and it's true, I remember covering those numbers and doing that story, how voters who self-described as more conservative, they picked Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton. But I think that the reasoning behind that is also similar to why Trump was able to say the things about protecting Social Security and doing infrastructure in the Republican primary and still win. Because I think there's this, again, to go back to the lazy pundit class, I think there's this accepted dogma among those people that, like, well, the U.S. is a center-right country. That's just what we are. And they're basing that off of, well, some of them are just saying it out of their ass and they've heard it from other people before and they're just parroting it. But there's one poll that's, when they ask the American people, hey, where do you describe yourself on the political spectrum? They describe themselves as center-right. And what that analysis misses is when you actually go issue by issue. So when you ask the American people, okay, what are your feelings on Social Security? What are your feelings on taxing the rich? What are your feelings on the minimum wage? What are your feelings on stopping these wars overseas? You go down the list, it's on almost every issue. The American people are actually solidly liberal. And I think in a weird way, that's, a clear reason why Bernie Sanders did super well and even did well among conservatives, because those conservatives don't even know how liberal they are. But with Donald Trump, that's another reason why he did so well and why he ended up winning, is because all the things that people thought, like, oh, no, you don't cross that line in a Republican primary, he was like, really? Watch me. And he did it, and it was the right thing to do. In fact, I'm curious to see what happens the next time there's a Republican primary, because if they learned anything from this is populism cuts across party lines. So if you're a protectionist in your trade policies, if you say I'm going to defend the social safety net, depending on how you frame it, yeah, of course, voters who self-describe as super conservative are going to like it. The only people who might actually be against it are the principled libertarians who really are in favor of a much more, anarcho-capitalist type economic system.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly interpretations of the outcome that could be seen as a vindication of a left-wing economic populist program, and I'm not discounting that. I think maybe what's more central to what the analysis should be is that the kind of like the paradigm on the left and right that we thought we viewed American politics through is no longer as relevant. So I mean, there's nothing. It's not an inherently liberal position to want to preserve Social Security and Medicare, right? I mean,
I think it
a
is,
lot of
but go
a
ahead.
lot of liberals believe that, but there's not. I mean, you can make a conservative argument, or like a more a paleo-conservative, or even a nationalist type argument in favor of preserving those programs. So in the UK, I mean, the standard Tory position, Conservative Party position, is to support the National Health Service.
Right.
Um, and in fact, they view that as sort of a necessary concession to the working class after World War II. And they viewed it as sort of conservative triumph that they were able to sort of enact that. Of course, there are always going to be certain elements of the coalition that dissent from the prevailing view, but that's just all to say that I don't think it's necessarily an inherently liberal view. So, I mean, when I think.
Well, yeah, we're
So,
just arguing terms here. So there's different conceptions of conservatism. One of them being, are you in favor of tradition? Tradition is like a conservative thing. Another conception of conservatism being like fiscal conservatism and small government. I guess I was arguing from that particular flavor of conservatism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I think that's true, and I guess there's the big losers really are the libertarians because there were for a while there, a couple of years ago, there were seen to be this sort of libertarian moment or something.
Right.
And remember, Rand Paul was kind of talked up as a leading light in the party, and I think both parties have sort of shifted dramatically from at least a conventional libertarian style view of things. So, I mean, I think if anybody's a clear loser, it's them.
Yeah, with Trump for sure. Trump is very, he's like the opposite of a libertarian because when it comes to civil liberties, in a social sense, he's like he spoke about how he wants nationwide stop and frisk. There are. He's mentioned at times when he's not contradicting himself, deporting 11 million undocumented immigrants and all those things, banning 1.6 billion Muslims. So, those things are massively not libertarian. And then, again, like we were talking about before with his economics. Yeah, when he's saying protect Social Security. By the way, I don't know what he's actually going to do on those ones because he's appointed some questionable people, to the Social Security Administration, or he wants to, who are on the record as wanting to privatize it. So I don't know what he's actually going to do, but at least in rhetoric, the libertarians should dislike him, which is why it's hilarious that a guy like Alex Jones, who's a conspiracy theorist, but he claims to be a libertarian, has been basically blowing Trump for months now.
Yeah, it's just I don't know what Trump's going to do either, and I hate this impulse that you see often among pundits, which is you have to keep making predictions constantly about what's going to happen in the future. I mean, there's so much information already before us, and that's observable in the real world. You don't need to be constantly in this pose of predicting what's going to happen months in advance or even years in advance. I mean, I think that sort of led to what led to their collective downfall. But think about it this way. Let's just stipulate, for the sake of argument, that Trump sincerely does want to carry out his pledge of preserving Social Security and Medicare, right? Who would he have to pick from in the roster of Republican potential appointees that would be able to implement that agenda? I mean, there aren't that many. I mean, he defied the
I'd
orthodoxy.
say there's probably none. There's probably
right.
none.
So I mean, who's available to him? I mean, there's almost nobody. So I think people may be overreading these appointments a little much, just because, for purely practical reasons, when you're talking about staffing the government, there's a limited pool of people if you're a Republican to do that for you.
Yeah, no, I'm a
So I
little
mean, again,
harsher on this.
I don't know what Trump's going to do. I mean, he was consistent about that the entire campaign, and he's even said reiterated it after the election. So, who the hell knows with him? But I mean, I wouldn't put too much stock in kind of hyper analyzing these appointments.
I think I'm a little harsher than you on this point because some of them are just. I mean, when you're rightly ranting against Hillary Clinton for her ties to Goldman Sachs, and then you want to appoint a guy from Goldman Sachs for Treasury Secretary, and you want to appoint a guy to lead the office for the budget. I mean, the president of all people, the president of Goldman, he wants in his administration. Meanwhile, this guy was tied to shady debt deals in Greece, and Steve Mnuchin, the other one, he's got a bunch of problems. I mean, Bernie was right about Goldman. The system was built on fraud there. The business model was fraud. So, I can't excuse appointing people like that, and I can't excuse Attorney General Jeff Sessions either.
I don't excuse him. I'm just saying.
No, I'm saying that's an indication of where he's going to go, especially with Jeff Sessions.
But Jeff Sessions was his first endorsement from a senator, right? So it's not a surprise that he would appoint Jeff Sessions. That's another thing about this. That's what I don't like about this, the liberal take on Trump. I mean, they try to portray everything in the most exaggerated, hysterical possible terms, as if Trump's appointment of Jeff Sessions should be seen as a departure from what Trump was promoting over the course of the campaign. No, Jeff Sessions was a senior policy advisor to Trump. His speechwriter, Miller, became Trump's top speechwriter. So, I mean, it shouldn't have been a shock to anybody that he appointed Jeff Sessions. I mean, that's not an endorsement of Jeff Sessions. I don't like Jeff Sessions at all. I just don't like the distorted portrayal of what is actually happening.
No, it's not a shock on practical grounds. Like, the evidence was there that somebody like him might become Attorney General. I totally agree with you on that. But I'm saying there should be shock as to the direction that a guy like Jeff Sessions is unquestionably going to go in. Like, there should be anger over the fact that this is a guy who said good people don't smoke marijuana, and of course it's still the case that under federal law, marijuana is still a Schedule I drug and illegal, and he could shut down all this progress that we've made if he just gets a nod from President Trump. So, yeah, there are concerns over a guy like that shouldn't have that position, and that's to say nothing of whether or not the evidence was there to indicate that a guy like that would have that position, because the evidence was there that a guy like that would have that position.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, hopefully there's enough of a critical mass of people on the left and right who could exert pressure on Sessions and also Trump to not mess with the marijuana state laws that have been enacted. I mean, I don't know. I hope so.
Backlash to that, I'm curious what the backlash to that would be, because now it's almost like you're right at that tipping point, the point of no return, where it's like marijuana is now legal in California. Like, California fell, Colorado, Washington. There's enough states now where if you crack down, and again, they have the legal authority to do it, what kind of a reaction would there be? Would there be this backlash? And would that be something, that might be something on that issue alone, if they crack down on that, that may threaten his reelection, no matter how shitty the Democratic candidate is that they put up against him.
Yeah, I think something to bear in mind about Trump is that he craves validation.
Right.
And he wants to be as popular as possible. I mean, he's not a conservative zealot. I mean, that's what all the rival Republican candidates said over and over again.
Yeah,
right?
That's Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz, I think, is the zealot. Trump is
right.
not. Right.
So Cruz would say constantly, he's not a true conservative. He's actually a liberal. He gave money to Democrats. And all that was correct. I mean, Trump wasn't a true conservative.
Yeah.
Which is why it's still pretty amazing they ended up winning the Republican nomination. But if Trump sees it as electorally disadvantageous to take a hard line on marijuana, I think he's probably going to be inclined not to take a hard line on marijuana. And again, there could be a whole host of factors at play if he's making that determination. But I mean, I think in general, Trump wants to be loved. I mean, that's kind of a softy way to put it. But he wants, even when, like, remember when he meets with Barack Obama, who he's just, raised the most ridiculous criticisms about over the years, the birther nonsense and everything
else. He's a good guy. He's a good man.
He's a good guy. Maybe we'll even keep Obamacare. I mean, I think that's fundamentally what Trump is about, right? He's not, and that's why I don't like this imputation of fascism or of, hardline conservatism.
Yeah.
Not because there are no problems with Trump, but you want to have a clear-eyed view of who he is so you can counteract his worst impulses effectively.
You made an interesting point. We went back and forth a while ago on Twitter. We've done it a few times, but it was specifically on this point of fascism, where I had done that. I had kind of loosely referred to him as a fascist, and basically your counter-argument was, well, look, man, there are historical implications to using that term. So if you call somebody a fascist, you're just, by definition, invoking Mussolini and Hitler. And if you invoke Mussolini and Hitler, well, then the rational response to that becomes go get a gun and make sure go in the street and like overthrow the government. And so that's an interesting point. It's a point about how the rhetoric can lead to action, and so if the rhetoric's not exactly precise, that could be a problem. And then basically, you know, I think it's more fair. I think you're right that it's more fair to just refer to him as an authoritarian. So, and
Yeah.
even that's not a good enough label because you have to encapsulate his positions on everything, and that's not really an all-encompassing position. That's just to say something about his stance on social issues, if you will, and his like kind of thin-skinned, impulsive nature to like be vindictive and stuff. But yeah, I think that's a fair point to say. Well, go with authoritarian because it has all the implications of saying stuff like maybe we should lock people up for flag burning and suing people over writing an article about him as he's done. So it encapsulates all that without the further baggage and kind of hysteria of fascism.
Yeah, I don't think we have a good word for Trump yet because he's sort of a unique figure. I mean, he was a reality TV show star who somehow entered the political realm and bulldozed all his opposition and won the presidency. So, like, already that's not something that we have any precedent for. So it's understandable if we don't, off the tip of our tongues, have a correct word to categorize him with. And I like the phrase petty authoritarian just because it's sort of petty to taunt your opponents in the way he does and to just try to exact revenge on people, even if it's not part of a grand ideological vision. That's sort of what he does and has over the course of his career. So, and that's just my preferred phrase because even authoritarian, it's sort of not doesn't fully fit because there are aspects of Obama that are authoritarian as well. I mean, the
Sure.
worldwide assassination program,
Right. Yeah.
and certainly George W. Bush had authoritarian tendencies out the wazoo, right?
Oh,
So,
totally.
I mean, if we're trying to come up with a term that uniquely describes Trump, you need some work to do. And the invocation of fascism is just sort of it's lazy and it's alarmist in my view. I mean, I've always said I'm open to an art. If somebody wants to present rationally an argument that Trump is a fascist, I'm open to hearing it. I just don't see it as analytically accurate, and in fact,
So
I see it as a distraction.
So
Um,
there is an argument, and it's an argument I've made, but the issue with it is there's a leap from spoken word to action that is implied in it, and if you don't agree that the leap would be taken to do that, then it's not like he's a fascist in reality. He's a fascist in rhetoric. So, for example, when he says, I want to take out their families, don't just kill ISIS, kill their families, take out their families. When he repeatedly said on the campaign trail, which now he's somewhat backpedaled on a little bit, we're going to torture. We're going to torture. We're going to waterboard. We're going to do worse than waterboarding. We're going to torture, quote, even if it doesn't work. Like, you take the amalgamation of being pro-torture and, ban 1.6 billion Muslims from coming into the country and kill their family members on purpose, which I do think is kind of like a step above and beyond just the gross negligence of like Obama or Hillary Clinton of like, yeah, okay, civilians died and that's horrible, but what are you going to do? When somebody says like, no, that's the point, like I want to kill the civilians, there's an intent issue there. So that's the argument for him being a fascist, but the counter-argument to that is fair, and the counter-argument is, well, those were things he said on the campaign trail. He hasn't done them, so you don't know if that would manifest into reality. Because then on the flip side, you could isolate some of the things he said and then walk away from the conversation with a mixed picture that he's fairly liberal on some issues like Social Security, like we said before, infrastructure spending, even sometimes with foreign policy on intervention. He went to the left of Hillary on many issues, Syria being one of them that was prominent, where he's like, yeah, no, I'm not going to get involved. Why would we do that? Let Assad kill ISIS and let's stay out of it.
yeah, it's just he blathered so many words. Just the sheer number of words that he spoke over the course of this campaign, it's almost impossible to fathom. I mean, he did a rally a day at least,
Yeah, at
and
least.
in the last like 2 months or so, it was multiple rallies a day.
Yep.
And then the final week, he ended up doing 7 rallies in one day. I mean, on the final day, that's
It's
crazy.
amazing. Yeah.
And then the number of interviews and tweets and everything else. So people will cherry pick And I don't think it's wrong to cherry pick the more egregious statements,
Right.
but you have to bear in mind that the sheer breadth and enormity of the number of things that he said. Like, you could make an argument that you could say Trump is a libertarian, and you could cherry pick 5 statements that seem to align with a libertarian worldview, and you'd have an argument with just as much validity that he's a libertarian. I
Yeah.
mean, the point is he just sort of floods the zone with everything that comes into his mind at any given moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
That trying to discern some kind of coherent ideological disposition from that is sort of a fool's errand.
Yeah. And
Um,
I think you're making a good point, and I think that maybe the main takeaway from that is the contradictions in and of themselves are a huge issue. But I found that Trump, I feel like, is unique among politicians. That like whenever there was a contradiction, which was all the time, it didn't affect him. And in fact, I argued that definitely in the primary, I actually think it helped him because what would happen is, he would take polar opposite positions on certain issues from one day to the next day. And then I think that his followers, since they like the aura of Trump and they like the idea of Trump, this guy, like the idea of this successful guy, this billionaire who's for the common man who's going to come and take over and make everything okay, what they would do is they would dismiss the thing he said that was the thing they didn't like. They would look at the thing he said, which is the thing they agreed with, and they would just basically project onto him like that's the thing that I'm sure he believes. You see what I'm saying? So like if the aura is there and the seeming straight talking ability is there, which is something that he has, well, then it's just a matter of let me write off the things he says that I don't agree with and just insist that the things that I agree with are the things that he believes and the things he's going to fight for. So that allows people like evangelicals to vote for him, and despite his history, like he was in 2 softcore porn movies, not naked, but he was like in them briefly for Playboy, and his wife being naked all over the place. Like they could just write that off because, oh well, look, I think he means it when he says he's a man of God and yada yada. Isolate the statements you like, say that's the thing that he really believes, and then make your argument from that. So I actually think in a weird way, contradictions don't hurt him, whereas contradictions, I think, like if Romney contradicted himself, it was all over the news and it was a big deal. And Romney didn't know how to like talk his way out of it, whereas Trump could just fucking dismiss it and get away with it. It's really it's like a phenomenon in politics.
well, Trump could contradict himself literally in the same sense.
Right.
Um, and I think if you kind of narrow it to his most core devoted supporters, say the ones that were, his sort of electoral bedrock in the primary. And the reason why they were Trump supporters was not because they felt that he was a consistent proponent of any particular position. They were on board with Trump as a notion,
Right. Yeah.
Trump as an authority figure. So if you're in if you're a member of a church, right, and you have a pastor, you kind of presuppose that the pastor has a correct way about him. He's going to eventually come to the correct answer on any given question. So if the pastor might contradict himself on the way to arriving at his conclusion, that's not going to lead you to denounce your pastor.
Right. Yeah.
It's just going to say, oh, this is the way he kind of works through these issues. I think it's a similar effect with the most fervent Trump supporter. In that, I mean, Trump contradicting himself doesn't bother them because they didn't put faith in him, thinking that he was free of contradictions. They knew he's a contradiction.
Yeah, it's
I
that
can't tell.
he
I
stands
can't
for
tell
the
you.
broader truth. That's what they think. Like, oh, make America great again is the thing, and whatever it takes to get to that thing, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many Trump supporters I met who freely acknowledge that he's an asshole, or that he's even. I mean, I've heard a number of people actually use the phrase "full of shit," but that's why. But they like that. I mean, they're even along for the ride in a way. So I don't know. Trump kind of converted the U.S. electoral process into this reality TV adventure game that people enjoyed being along on the ride for.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And they're not going to hop off the ride just because he contradicts himself over the course of an interview. That's why it was different when Trump was accused of lying. It was of a qualitatively different nature than Hillary's alleged lies. So there was one just whopper of a lie that Hillary said in July of 2015 that I always want to remind people about. she was asked by Breonna Keeler on CNN, hey, didn't you kind of destroy these emails after you received a subpoena, which had only happened a couple months prior, March 2015? And Hillary, right to the camera, says, I never received a subpoena. And it's just like, hold on a second. You can go and she loved to fact check, right, Trump, but you can go and fact check Hillary on that and prove that, yes, she did receive a subpoena on March whatever, and they got and they deleted the emails on March whatever. So 3 weeks after receiving the subpoena, and that's just that lie is like a lawyerly, premeditated, deliberate lie in the way that Trump's lies just were not. I mean, Trump's lies were just word salad that could align with a consistent belief or not. People didn't really care. But when Hillary lied, it kind of permeated more because it was the type of lie that reminded you why you hate politicians.
That's true, but I do think it's almost too kind to Trump, though, because I feel like he gets away with it, but he still was guilty of those same kind of lies.
Maybe it's just Trump was he's the first major party nominee since Wendell Willkie in 1948
Yep.
to not have held elected office.
Mm-hmm.
So that you couldn't take a position that he put into the formal record as an elected official and compare it with a statement because there was no such record.
Yeah.
And so you sort of needed a different prism to try to discern Trump's dishonesty.
Yeah, you'd have to go based off of prior statements because he had never voted on anything political. So it was just a matter of it's like by definition an apples to oranges comparison because Trump was not a senator, Trump was not Secretary of State, so you had to go based off of what he said. But like the lie to me, there were a few from Trump that I was like, whoa, did you really just do that? But the equivalent of the Hillary thing you were just talking about is Trump on Libya. Trump, released a YouTube video from his office in whatever year it was, and he was basically like, yeah, we need to go in and topple Gaddafi. Let's go in and out. Let's attack him and get out. And then, later on the debate stage with Cruz brought that up, and he was like, hey, man, you were in favor of intervention in Libya. He's like, I never spoke about that. I don't know what you're talking about. I never mentioned Libya. And he did that a few times. There was like a few flips back and forth. And with Iraq, the big thing of I was against it. There's a tape of him on Howard Stern tepidly in favor of it. Like, I guess, whatever. But that's not even the big part of it. The big part of it is that after that, he had flipped his position like 33 times. And he's like, oh, I'm in favor of leaving and getting all the troops out. And then at one point he's like, no, we should have left but kept like 20 or 30,000 troops there. And then, also the weird contradiction of like, we need to get out, totally, but then being mad that we didn't take the oil. Like, I don't know. There were a bunch of weird issues of, like, oh, like he should have stayed there to fix it, but no, you should get out. Like, you shouldn't have gone in, but when you go in, don't get out until X, Y, and Z happens. I don't know. It was just, it was too much of a fucking mesh for me to take the guy seriously. It was just, he was obviously talking out of his ass.
And I wrote on all this stuff at the time. I have a daily news column specifically on the Libya thing, so you can go back and look at that if they want. But I just think the tack that people took to try to counteract Trump, meaning really hyper literal fact checking, trying to catch him in various lies. I mean, that obviously didn't work, right? So when something doesn't work over such an extended period of time, maybe you should try to alter your approach.
Yeah.
That's part of why I've done this pundit thing and why I tried to point out over the course of the campaign when the liberal reaction to Trump was overwrought or unhelpful. There needs to be a different approach here that doesn't involve just kind of shrill fact check. I mean, whenever these people do claim that they're doing a fact check, I imagine there's a nerd behind his laptop screaming fact check, and it's like it doesn't resonate with ordinary people. So you need to figure out a different way to go about this.
So I thought the problem with the attacks on Trump was more based on the fact that they focused on all the wrong things when going after him. So, for example, there was like a Republican ad that was released at one point of Trump like cursing for a minute straight, just saying things like that. There was one big story that CNN ran with for a full day about how Trump was giving a campaign speech, and he said like the TPP is going to rape us. And the fact that he said the word rape, it was like fucking everybody went nuts. And they were like, how dare you say that? So what I noticed about the bad coverage of Trump that I think helped him is that a lot of it was focused on this like PC outrage word police angle, as opposed to, I would actually argue the way that you could have brought him down was to do what you were suggesting might be a bad idea, which is, yes, you fact check him, but you have to fact check him on the right thing. You have to get outraged about the right thing. So, like, it wasn't even a big story when he said on Fox and Friends that let's take out their families. Let's kill the families of terrorists in the Middle East. That wasn't even a big story. Like, they didn't run with that for a day or 3 days or a week. If I was in charge, if I was, the head of fucking CNN and I'm calling the shots on the programming, I'd say, look, that's what we're fucking talking about, because this guy just said, like, I want to be a terrorist, and that's the goal. So I agree with outrage and fact-checking, but it's got to be on the right things. It can't be on, like, stupid non-scandals that you're making scandals.
Well, I always said during the campaign that if I were advising Hillary and if I wanted to give her the best strategic advice, I would have said, forget about this personality stuff and don't try to make the election a referendum on whether Trump said something mean about Miss Universe, right?
Right. That's another good example, by the way.
Yeah, focus on his personal corruption liabilities. So,
yes.
Mafia connections. He bilked plenty of small business owners over the course of his career in the sleazy casino industry. I mean, people are maybe vaguely aware of the history, but they don't know it acutely. So that could have been emphasized to a much greater degree than they ended up doing. And instead, they did this thing, it's sort of like a PC type thing.
Right.
And it's not to excuse Trump's language in any individual instance. It's just to say that if that's your main focus, people are just going to get
they roll their
it.
eyes. They're like, okay, we're adults here and we're having an adult conversation, and instead of talking about serious issues, you're mad that the guy said something that's off color. Like, no, let's talk about real issues. But before we wrap up, I just want to ask you. Do you want to name some of the outlets and some of the people that were the worst offenders on this whole thing? Because I'd love that. I mean, you've done a great job covering it on your Twitter feed. You sending out the articles that they did with the goofy ass headlines that are dead wrong. So could you share some of that with the audience?
I would love to. There are some low-hanging fruit that I haven't bothered to focus on at all because they're just so self-evidently cartoonish that it's not even really worth it. So you have people like David Brooks, Tom Friedman, Bill Kristol. I mean, Bill Kristol is just trolling people, so he doesn't even try to be correct. So I don't even think it's worthwhile to dwell on those guys. I've tried to, I've tried to emphasize people who are maybe a little bit younger, the emerging pundit type,
right,
who get a lot of undue adulation by their contemporaries. So we went over Buoy. I actually wrote so my pundit accountability initiative is not like a well-defined thing. Like I do some posts here and there. I have a piece coming out next week in a different outlet that's going to focus on two people, particularly Buoy and this guy Brian Beutler from the New Republic. And just to point on him, he won't return my emails now, sadly, because I'm trying to get them to. I'm trying to I submitted written questions to them to get them to comment on their various failings, but they won't reply. But Beutler popularized this meme where. So there was a trope that economic anxiety couldn't have possibly fueled Trump's ascendancy in any way, right?
Yes,
so he
I know
would
it well. Yeah.
So he would try to denigrate that trope, or he would try to denigrate the idea that economic anxiety was one explanation for why Trump was gaining popularity by pointing to some kind of outlandishly stupid conduct of an individual Trump supporter at a rally or on Twitter or somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, this must be economic anxiety." Which is just the most ridiculous way of trying to disprove that thesis. And sure enough, economic anxiety was a predictor of where Trump gained support relative to 2012. And even 538, which is like the crown jewel for these people, acknowledges that. And then there are other studies. Okay, so he's one guy who didn't just make wrong predictions. I mean, anybody can make an erroneous prediction. What's really more damning is if your entire kind of analytical framework is wrong.
Right, totally.
So it's not just about one isolated prediction. It's about your premises being faulty, And that should be more of an indictment of you, and that should like cause you to contemplate maybe pursuing different work.
And it's
But
also a straw man because nobody claims that all Trump voters are like, oh, economic anxiety and it's a backlash to that. All we're saying is, sure, there are some that are racist and bigoted and xenophobic, but don't paint them all like that and acknowledge that some of them, yes, it's economic anxiety, and like you said, that's been proven.
yeah, and then so I wrote another article specifically on this one guy, Alex Seats Wald. You know who I'm talking about?
Yes.
With MSNBC, he actually works for Think Progress, formerly, and Salon. And he is not quite a pundit. He's more supposedly a reporter. He covered the Hillary campaign and the Bernie campaign, and he pretty obviously colluded with the Hillary campaign. Okay, and there's all different sorts of evidence drawn from WikiLeaks and drawn from my own stuff that I've come across that I put in a Medium post on November 17th. So people want to go look at that. They can go. I thought it was worth a narrowly tailored post to Alex in particular because he's not really quite a pundit. He's one sort of example who would just. I mean, he was one of the guys who still who tried to play up the notion of Bernie delegates in Nevada wreaking havoc and fighting and causing violence.
Oh, yeah.
He popularized that meme, and he's never retracted it, even though it's totally bogus, right? So he's just another example. I mean, I'm trying to focus on these types of pundits and commentators and journalists who sort of would fly under the radar if I wasn't on their case.
Right, yeah.
So, I mean, those are some examples. I mean, I could go with more. Jonathan Chait, who was like a parody. He on the day before the election, not only did he say that Trump wouldn't win Michigan, which he did, Chait said he was offended at the suggestion that anybody would claim that Trump had a possibility of winning Michigan.
No, I remember you
tweeting
about that, and
Chait used to live in Michigan. Chait used to live in Michigan, okay?
And first of all, let me just pause real quick just to say that the word offended is really funny to me and really weird to me because it's like, it's a way of claiming like, oh, you're wrong without the person having to be wrong. It's like, oh, I'm offended by this. Like, like, what does that mean? Like, are you offended by something that's true? Are you, like, what? Like, that,
I mean, I think it was sort of tongue-in-cheek. I don't think he was actually stating that he took genuine offense, but, like, the way that he dismissed
he was serious. I do.
I don't know. Who knows with him? But, those are some examples. Eventually I'm gonna put together a master list of this stuff.
I'm offended that anybody would think Trump would win.
Yeah.
And then he won.
I mean, the reason I'm never gonna get tired of this stuff. So for anybody out there, like I said, please keep sending it to me. Like I'm gonna.
Oh, they're so smug and wrong.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to be wrong, but then to be smug about your wrongness. I mean, that's when I get worked up, and that's when I'm gonna go after you. So
yeah, exactly.
I'm gonna compile a master list of this stuff in some form at some point soon, but I'm sort of doing it incrementally now.
All right, cool.
So yeah.
All right, so tell everybody your Twitter account and plug everything so that they can find you.
My Twitter account is mtracey, so that's Tracy with an E, MTRACEY. I'm writing now every day on Medium. I'm doing other work for other places as well in the meantime, but I'm trying to develop a new sort of journalistic model now with crowdfunding and everything else. So I've been really pleased with the amount of support I've gotten financially. And it's kind of allowed me to just focus on this Medium thing for now. And actually, in a week or so, Medium has approached me to try out this new subscription sort of model that they have within Medium itself. So one of the reasons why there was such horrible groupthink and confirmation bias within this media class is because they all sort of rely on the same sources for their financial sustainment, right? So if I can kind of break that model to my whatever small degree I can, I'm going to try to do that.
That's what we're doing too. We're trying to do that.
Yeah, so it's mtracy.com/ Oh yeah, and you're another example of that. So that's why I applaud you and other people who are trying to do new things. Yeah. So medium.com/ @mtracy, and then my personal website you can get on my Twitter, and then I've written all over the place, so you can kind of
All right.
on my personal website it has all the places I've written in the past. So.
Awesome. He comes highly recommended, guys. Thanks for joining me, man. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation, and keep up the good work.